So I'm gonna water this down. I like to do this with flesh tones. I like to sort of wash them all in. So I'm gonna, you know, in one fell swoop, and then maybe even here. And then I'm just gonna mix a real basic kind of Caucasian flesh tone. So I'm gonna do a little bit of yellow ochre, a little tiny bit of red, and some burnt sienna. And see how that looks. And these lights come in here. So I just want to get an overall tone here. I'll think kind of a little bit where the darks are. I'm not worried about brushing right over that beard. Why?
You're gonna paint over it.
But it's also like your scalp and things like that. You got skin under that, so it's fine. So what I'm starting to do here is just sort of start to tint things a little bit. Then what I like to do while it's still a little wet, sometimes I'll do it after, but let's see if we can do it right now. I'll grab a little of this red, really dilute it. I might not work right now because it's a little too wet. Yeah, it's okay. I like to warm up that nose a little bit. And the ears. Maybe a little there. And the nice thing also about watercolors, you don't have to worry about jacking up your brushes. And then we'll take a little of this. I think I'm gonna just do it. I might knock it. Okay, so I do something else with watercolor that I don't normally do. Hang on, let's get this a little bit. Now for this guy, I'd probably darken this part of his arm a little bit, probably. And the reason,
Like a farmer's tan.
yeah, exactly. I want to give him a little farmer's tan, but I probably will wait till it dries out a little bit. Let's see. And if I thought about it, I probably would have gave him a tank top. Because then I can get like chest hair and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's not too hard an edge, which I think is okay. Okay, another thing I want to do, I can't decide what this color shirt should be. This is usually, okay, so I'm going to get some of this. I think I want a little more, not too much. So let's knock it down a little bit. Okay, so here's your first thing on color. Okay, so what we just did with the flesh tone, a little yellow ochre, a little burnt sienna, a little red. If it's a darker flesh tone, I might start adding a little more burnt sienna in there to kind of get a little more brownish tone. If I'm starting to go into African American tones, I can go into a little bit, same idea, darken a little bit, but I can also start introducing some cools, a little more cools in there. Even violets, okay? But your basic, if you're just doing a basic kind of Caucasian flesh tone, is basically that, okay? That's a good starting point. I can add anything to that and start to push it around, okay? Let's just do this real quick. So all I want to do here on this hat is I just want to give it some little bit of tone. I still want to read as white, but I want a little bit of tone in there. I want to kill the white. Does that make sense? And then I'm going to go, if you're not really familiar with color mixing, what we're going to really start doing here is complements. Okay? So you're going to see me mixing a lot of complements. Like this purple, when I put it in here and I go, oh, I want to knock it back a little bit, I just throw a little bit of yellow in it, see how it knocks it down. Now, I might introduce a third color, nudge it a little bit. I might go, I want a little more blue back in there, but that's your basic thing to get started with color mixing. To keep it, to make it simple and where you guys can start approaching it, okay? Because when I came out of school, even though I had a lot of color theory and a lot of training, when I got into the field, it was sort of like, well, okay, I understand all that triadic and this, that, and the other, but how do I just mix some color and do this? And it's complements for the most part, okay? I'm gonna do, okay, so what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna mix a black. We don't want black on our palette, okay? There's times where you can use black, but you don't wanna use black right now while you're learning, because it's gonna completely derail you understanding color, okay? So I'm gonna get a little bit, and I never use black. And I'll use black for certain things, never for just like straight painting or anything, okay? So I'm gonna mix a little burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, and you can see I get a pretty nice black, okay? Now what's the difference between that and a black?
It's color.
It's got color, okay? I'm mixing color to color. Black is a color deadener. As soon as I put color on, or black on here, and you can do it, there's certain illustration styles and all that, and that's fine. But as soon as you start putting that on there, it starts to get really, it starts sucking all the color of everything around it, if that makes any sense. No, I totally, oh yeah, no, I know what I'm doing. This part is usually black. Sometimes I'll even go, can I take some of that in there? Is there any reflected light in this room? And if I don't like it, then I can go, I don't like it. And I can just go back. And I like that little touch of warmth in there, but before it was a little too much. Does that make sense? And then maybe I'll go here. Now here, actually, I might want some more of that warmth, depending on where he was. If he was like at a monster truck rally, he might be outside, and what that means is that's a very lit environment where there's sun coming down, a lot of warmth bouncing back up under into things. Does that make sense? So that's another thing where I'm looking at it and going, where can I get some color? And see, it's a little nicer having a little warmth in there, okay? And I can still go back over it after it dries and like put another wash over it and knock it down a little bit if I want, but that, I like having a little warmth in there. Does that make sense? Now I'm gonna mix a brown. Let's try a nice warm brown. So there's our orange. Let's go with cobalt. Too cool. A little more of this. Not quite dark enough for me. So I'm gonna go, I still wanna keep it warm. And I'm gonna go to a little bit of Viridian, which goes pretty dark. Now, whenever you're mixing a complement, the trick is, which color is gonna live more, okay? So I can, if you notice when I just mixed that a second ago, it went really bluish gray. I don't want bluish gray, I want it more like a hair, dark brownish, warm gray like that, okay? So I can push the red a little more, and that neutral color is gonna get a little warmer, or I can let the blue live a little more. So that'll happen almost with anything you're mixing, okay? What do I want to live more? Is it, if I knocking my purple down, I just wanna knock it a little down and knock a little more yellow into it, but not too much, okay? If I wanna make a full-on brown, then I'm gonna have to balance it out and get a brown, okay? So I'm trying to balance this out, and I want a little more warmth in it. That's probably okay. I think, let's see what we get here. That'll probably work. I'm gonna let that line carry some of it. And what I'm basically doing here is just my basic start washes. Does that make sense? So I'll only take it so far. This side's lit, so that his hair on this side could be a little lighter, okay? But you see how that line work is helping me out there? It's giving it texture in there. Now I might wipe the whole thing out as I'm working, but I might go, I like that little bit of line in there, so that's cool. I could come in here, maybe make some of his beard gray, maybe. I'm not gonna do it here, but. And another thing. And then for sure, at some point, I'm gonna introduce another value in here. I might even do a little bit of it. And again, we're starting to do what I was talking about before. I'm starting to vary. I've got that in there. I want to start knocking some shapes in there. Some variation of color, temperature, whatever it is I'm doing. And this guy's not super young, so he could get some sort of grays knocking that all down. Now, let's see if that's dry. It's still not dry. I want to get a little under here. I want to get a little darker. Now I don't have to go to that to get that. I could go here to get darker. Then I have to go, do I like that hard edge right there? I'm not sure if I do, so I'm going to soften a little bit. Oh, and I got to get a little here. I want to be careful here because I like the scraggly mustache, so I don't want to overemphasize that. Now let's see if this is still wet. You can see I kind of lost, I got a little bit of that warmth on his nose, but not a lot. I like that warmth on the nose. And you can actually go, this is going to dry a little lighter than it's looking. You can actually go pretty red on the nose, okay? Especially when you're doing something silly like this. And then I usually just take a little bit of the flesh tone. I can add a little of that. I add a little warmth to it. I can get sort of the lip color a little bit. Because you have the same thing there on your lips. It's just that there's more capillaries or something, I forgot. So it's more or less your flesh tone, but it goes redder, okay? Sometimes it doesn't. You can look at it and it'll goes to a dull pink. Okay, it's not really all that red. Okay, so let's go. Let's figure out. I think I'm gonna give this shirt like a color. Like what should it be?
Green shirt.
Give
him a green shirt.
I keep wanting to go to a black, but then I go, I don't really want to go to a black.
Blue, green.
Well, here's one thing that I do a lot. Now you got to be careful. See how there's a little bit of muck in there? I don't really care for the sake of this, but be careful on that. Like you're putting, you just want to put really pristine water down. Make sure that you get clean water, and make sure that your brush is clean. Okay. And I wouldn't mind it if this is still wet and it sort of bleeded into my shirt a little bit. So I'm gonna knock this red down a little bit. So there's a little trick you can do with different colors, because one thing you want, okay, so you don't really have this problem as much with watercolor, But what I always do, because you're not really adding white to this, you're using the white of the paper, which is actually kind of nice. But a lot of times if I'm doing it with an opaque media, is I move the red into the light. I'll just go to a more saturated red. Does that make sense? And it'll start to read like it's picking up light instead of me adding white. Okay, so once I add white, it's gonna start going pink, which can be okay.
So the light is brightening the color.
Yeah, so what I'm doing is I'm tricking your eye because I'm going, and you know, it does happen actually.
It's defining.
As it's going into the light, it's just getting redder.
Okay.
Okay, or it could even go, and I do this all the time too, whereas it starts to go in the light, it can start to really warm up with a little bit of orange. You see what I mean? And then if I go darker over here, so I'm always tempering this. You know, if I go over here, I can go darker and start to intermingle that, and I'm gonna start to get a nice wet into wet thing going. Does that make sense? What people do, again, is they just go in here and they just put this big block of red down. It's like, well, that doesn't look very interesting. That makes sense? And I want to get, and this is my underpainting, so this is just kind of where I'm starting. Does that make sense?
Okay.
I'm going to constantly keep tweaking this out, but this is sort of my underpainting. And I'm only going to take it so far. I'm going to get a little, and I think I'm just going to use cobalt. I don't think because I can gray it down after the fact if I want. Get him some kind of bluish glasses. And I'm also, I think I'm going to take this and some of that, and I'm going to reinforce this. And another thing, as soon as I start going on this, then I start knowing exactly. Okay, now I'm gonna do another thing here. I'm gonna take that same blue. I'm gonna kill it a little. Still want it to be blue, but a little darker value. I'm going to give him a little shadow because he's got this big thing over the top of his thing, so it gives me an excuse to put a little shadow at the top of his glasses, and I'll probably have to reinforce this a little bit in a minute. So a lot of these things that I'm doing, once I do them, I'm going to, I might have to reinforce them, and I have to wait for it to dry and stuff like that. Does that make sense? I'm also going to take a little bit of a dark value right there. So what I'm going to do in a minute when that dries, I'm going to come in there and knock in a few shapes, sort of like what I did here. Knock some interior shapes inside those glasses. Does that make sense? And then bing, and then it looks like it's shining. Okay, so then I'm going to reinforce this just a hair. I'm going to give them a little more on this side. That's good. I'm going to give them a little more orangey ears. Now the reason I do the orangey ear thing, and a lot of this looks screaming, it's going to dry lighter. You're not going to see it as much. The reason I do that with the orangey ears is if you ever notice, your ears are translucent. If somebody's talking to you and the sun's behind them, their ears will go screaming orange, right? They can also go a little reddish, that's up to you. Okay, so let's do a little more of this. And then, a little more here. I'm trying to cut that white out now. I always keep this in my hand. If I put a mark down I don't like, I lift it right out, okay? You always hear people and they go, oh, watercolor is so unforgiving, it's this, it's that, it's all this stuff. And I don't like it when they do that because it just scares everybody. Then I go, well, not if you just lift it out. Like if you just make that decision when you're looking at it and go, well, that doesn't work. Lift it out, right? I always hear people and they go, somebody here did this. There's a teacher here and she goes, I don't know, we're having a conversation. Anyway, some student brought that up. Anyway, so let's grab some of this dark. And I could start thinking about where my shadow values are going to be. See how I'm softening that edge? So I'm making a few decisions here about what kind of edges I want. Does that make sense? I think that's fine. There's a couple of gathering folds here. And I'm being very broad stroke here because I just want you guys to get the idea. Does that make sense? And then what I like to do is I'll go, well, the light's here, so it can cast a big shadow from the side of his head off on here. And see how we built this big shape? Now we're starting to work into the shape. Does that make sense? Now here, I want this to be sort of hard edge, but I'm really, and it's not just me, it's anybody who's a painter. You really got to think about those edges, okay? So I'm gonna let that one live a little, just a little harder. You know, and at some point I could come in here and find a nice fold that cuts across. But I'm really probably gonna have to soften the bottom of that. Kind of kill it a little bit. I don't want too much. You know, there'd be a bump right there where his belly is and all that kind of stuff. Now, let's go one more thing. I want to mix up a little darker flesh tone. Now this could cool out, but I'm going to do something in a minute, so I don't think it's going to matter. I just want to get a little of that where his head's turning there. What is that noise? Can you guys hear that?
The clock.
Is it the clock?
Yep. Behind the screen.
This room is weird, man. All right. Okay, so you get the idea where I'm going. Does that make sense? Big shape, I start to work into the shape, right? I would be more careful with that one that's cutting across. And then we go back to here. He's got a little more of a red, I don't want a reddish beard actually, because it's going to clash with his shirt. But what I can say is there's an excuse for there to be a little more red in there because he's got a red shirt on. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I can kind of think of it as, and I would finesse that a little more, but I'm not going to right now. Okay, so let's dry it. Whenever I'm using a pure color, it's because of what's underneath it I know is going to kill it. Does that make sense? So I'm mixing it, I'm just letting it mix here. Because if I don't, I'm going to lose some of the vibrancy of this, in this case, of blue. If I kill this already, when I put it on here, it's going to get killed even more because the color this is transparent. The color underneath, it's going to kill it even more. Does that make sense? Okay. So let's pull a little of this. Okay, there it is. And I'm going to get this really, really diluted. And I'm going to give them, and their ultramarine blue is really different than normal. And I'm going to start giving them a little bit of a 3-day beard, like cool off this bottom part. Does that make sense? Man, that's a really different ultramarine blue. It's weird. Might be green shade, which I don't want. I use red shade. Okay, so I'm going to kill this. It's too much right now. And it should dry quite a bit. Now, depending on how bummy I want them to look, I can leave it pretty blue. And this guy, I think it'll be fine, because when it dries, you can see it's starting to cool his beard down a little, or the bottom of his face down a little bit. You see that? And it starts to give it that little bit of a 3-day beard kind of true up. It works really good if he was like a bum, okay? But a guy that's this rough, I can get away with it, okay? Because you look like a trucker or something. Okay, and then I'm gonna get a little more.
Did they ever notice you drawing them?
Not usually. I'm really good at not being noticed. I mean, I can draw people. I mean, I can draw people that are right there, and they won't even notice it. Like when I would drive ride on the train, they have like a bench here, and then the next bench is like that where you're sitting, and I'd be sitting there drawing, and they wouldn't even know it. And part of it right now, everybody's so insanely narcissistic right now that they're really not paying attention to anything other than themselves. I mean, it's true. I mean, go on Instagram, it's so gross, like the way people are behaving. You know. Plus I'm an old guy, so it's a different thing.
Has someone ever asked you not to draw them?
I don't think so. But if they did, I would say, yeah, that's fine. You know what I mean? I'm not gonna argue with them. I've had people where they're on to me every now and then.
To draw them?
Like I was just thinking about this last night, because I always had these fun encounters with people. See how he's starting to kind of pull together a little bit? I was drawing this old guy. I want to start getting some contrast against the side of his ear and all that. Then I'm always managing these edges, because I do want it to get a little lighter as it goes out. That's not too bad. I reinforce that a little bit. Now, I would just keep going. Does that all make sense? This is just sort of, probably take me about another half hour to finish them, 15 minutes, something like that, right? One of the things, if you notice, if I go, I've got this under base. Let's do another thing. Now I should clean this water out because it's clearly got a lot of warmth in it, but I'm not going to. I'm going right up to the edge of him. And I can see where the water is hitting the page. So I'm actually thinking about how I want this to kind of go. So I'm just going to give him a little vignette. Does that make sense? Now, also, if I put blue, it's starting to indicate maybe he's outside. So that also can justify some of my lighting if I want. And I want this to make some interesting edges. Then let's go a little further here. See, that just adds a little more interest. Does that make sense? And I'm going to let it just sort of do its thing. Another thing, by the way, just kill it a little bit. So we start to get a little vignette. Does that make sense? Does that all make sense, you guys?
Yeah.
So I just keep going, right? This I would really have to start working into. His hair is starting to work because it's getting that nice broken edge, which is partly the drawing and partly the paint. But you guys get it. I just mix a little gouache in there, yeah? You know, you don't want to overdo that like I just did. Okay, but, and there was one other thing I wanted to say. Oh, I could start also bringing back this red in his shirt. You see that? Because I want to make sure the statement on that shirt is that it's red. Okay, another thing I do, because I want to control the water, or whatever we're using, in this class will always be water, I'll put it here and I'll just barely control it like that. I don't want, because if I just dump it in, it's gonna get too diluted. Okay, so I want to make sure I'm controlling how much water is on here all the time. Yeah, I just get like a corner. I can put this back over that. It's still going to be a shadow value, but it's going to have more color in it. Who said that? That's an epiphany, right? Then I can come back in here and grab a little more of that and go, well, maybe I'll reinforce that. Maybe I should give him a little more of a collar indication here. I could start bouncing some of the warmth up into his neck. See, I'm starting to get a little bit warmed up. That all make sense? Fairly simple, right? Oh, one more thing. See, the problem with this is I don't want to stop once I start. You know what I mean?
How do you know when to stop?
That's the trick. That's the trick.
Because I know some people that like they keep adding more to the point where it just takes
You overwork
away from
it. Yeah, you overwork it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna leave that on like that. It's gonna dry a little. Another thing I could do maybe, I'm gonna go to this pure, what do we call it? I'm gonna really dilute it though. A lot of times on this warmth, because it's basically a yellowish warm, and that's a little strong, I would have knocked that down. Sometimes I can get away with a nice little purpley shadow. Just kind of cool it down. Works really nice on warm things. Yeah, that's not too bad. You see that? Now why? Because that purple is really over a pretty warm, kind of a orangey. It's got yellow in it, and it's gonna kill the violet. Okay. And do another thing. This I would probably emphasize a little more. That little shadow in there. A little bit of that. And a little bit under here. Kill this down here a little bit. And it'll kill some of that blue a little bit, but leave a little bit in there. Yeah, that's better. Okay, okay, all that makes sense? And I'd probably put a couple of dark shapes inside the glasses to sort of pull that together. And we got our trucker guy. Yeah?
Yep.
Okay, so it's fairly simple. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm gonna mix a purpley gray. And I'm also, yeah, let's just do this. I want to pop a little warmth in there. Some of this is just gonna get lost under my washes. Does that make sense? See how I'm pulling those branches out of the wet mix? That's a nice little trick. Actually, it's not a trick. A little more. And I varied the wash. Do you see that? Goes a little neutral. That's a really nice neutral. Goes warmer, goes a little purpley. Okay. I want to dry this, I think. Now, I'm going to wet this down a little bit. I'm going to see if I can do it where I start thinking about the tree masses a little bit. Why are you guys so far away? You guys can see okay? Okay. As long as you can see. I'm gonna put that there. I'm gonna leave in some sky holes in here is what I'm trying to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now this, I don't want to use that. That's way too much. I'm gonna go. Let's see what we
Didn't you
get.
normally paint the sky first?
Sometimes. Yes, usually I would. For the purposes of demo, I don't really care.
Sure. Sure. Just curious.
Yes, it depends, really. You know what I mean? I can do it either or, to be honest. So let's try this. And then let's just try that. I want more of it, though. That's not too bad. Yeah, I'm going to kind of do the same thing we did before. So what we're talking about here is letting the washes do the work. Does that make sense? Where did Chris go? You go about him? I'm going to add a little warmth in there because it's fall, yeah? Where'd you go, Chris? Where'd you go?
The overall.
I have a camera in there. You weren't in there. Okay. Now, here, I don't like that hard edge. I'm going to soften that a little bit. That's good. I'm going to do something here in a minute. I want to really darken this while it's still wet. Now, if you notice, I didn't complement it or anything. All I did was, I just mixed a little darker value of the same thing, okay? Because that's going to keep color in this, which I want to really make sure I do. And then, down here, I'll break some of those leaves loose. Does that make sense? I don't want them. I want to break that silhouette a little bit. And then later on, I might even go in and put in a few little leaf shape ideas in there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so we just let the washes do all of it. Does that make sense? Bunch of wet into wet stuff, okay? So let's do one more thing.
If you were to do it in this order, would you wait for this to dry and then paint the sky?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things I might do. I might go, I want this all to bleed into the sky,
Yeah, that's what I'd be worried about,
but I might want that.
especially like with the sky holes in the tree.
Yeah, the sky holes I can just take and go, pop, pop, pop. It's fine. Okay, so let's dry it, because to your point, yes, this time I do want it dry. Just gonna pull a few things out. And I think I'm just gonna go with a straight cobalt. We're out of space here, hang on. I'm gonna flood it a little bit. Try to keep that leading edge moving, otherwise you'll get a hard line, which is why I usually do this with super wet into wet. Gets lighter towards the horizon, right? And I'm gonna pull it all the way down here. Just gonna move it. I'm just gonna pull all the way over the mountains too. Start to get some little cloud ideas in there. What I love about the toilet paper is it makes pretty complex shapes. You see that? Does that make sense? Get it lighter down here. And we're getting a little bit of a cloudy idea. Does that make sense? I'll do another thing real quick. Let's get a little more information in there. If you just tap it, it'll just take up some of that excess water. And I'm gonna go here. Let's go right here in the foreground. For this textury stuff or ground stuff or whatever, I like it to be, I like to go wet and wet so I get a lot of shapes. That'll probably be okay. Now this is a good place where I could throw salt in and get some nice little textures. Does that make sense? Let's go a little more of this green. A little green. Now usually when I throw down something like that, I like to grab this brush. Actually this one. My liner brush. Huh? And I like to start pulling out little grassy ideas. I like to push these. It looks like there's a little indication of a rock. Maybe I'll put a rock in there. I'm gonna go with a really screaming. Now, you notice I'm just going in with this pure color. Why? Because it's gonna mix with my color I already have here.
It's still wet.
It's all wet. And then I could go, here's my, and that's my starting point. I mean, salt. Now, if I use it like this, it's not really gonna pop out that much. It's just gonna give me texture, okay? And then another thing I can do, once I get that going, I would go over it. let's get, that's too wet. I don't like it that wet. So I'm not gonna add a lot of water to this, which I just keep picking that up, so it screwed me up. Get most of that water off of it. And I also keep a piece of paper for this. See, now I'm getting a little bit of a nice dry brush. You see that? Now I can also use that over that. So I'm combining things, so it's not like, oh, salt texture. It's like just texture. And people look at it and go, God, that's complex texture. And they think you painted all of it, okay? I can also take this and splay it. Get different kind of mark making. You know, I can also do it this way. You know, I might put some ground texture like that where I get sort of a grassy texture. Does that make sense? What is all this doing? It's letting the tools and the paint do all the work. Because you guys have seen this 100 times and thought they painted that. Okay, and they did that. Okay? And then I can come in here and, you know, I can pull it off of here and maybe put another layer of it. You know, and start to build some nice textures in here, like that. Maybe pull some of my green in here. Start to follow my form a little bit. If I had a little hill here, start to intermingle these colors a little. And I start to get a nice little texture. Does that all make sense? Now, these mountains are starting to get blue now. They're starting to separate a little bit. So I'd probably go into maybe, either I'd hit them with a little harder blue. Sometimes you go out, I just saw it the other day. You go out and it's really blue. The mountains are crazy blue. And you can push them even a little bluer. Okay, or I might gray them out. They're actually kind of sitting in a nice spot right there where maybe if I put start to add some stuff out here. This would have to get grayer actually. I also don't want that dark. And this would get a little bluer out here actually. So I would probably give this a wash over this and get it a little bluer so it sits back there a little more. I also might come in here with this now. Get some of that out of there, and eventually I might put a little road in there. Does that make sense? That's sitting back not too bad. But I still might give it a little. Put that there. And another, oh, I don't have it here. Is there a ruler in here? Does anybody see a ruler in here? Now, I usually do this with an architectural scale, but you could do it with anything. Like back here, let's dry it. Like, you know, sometimes you get those sort of grids back there when you're looking up from far away. And we'll talk about this more when we're doing the architectural stuff. Let's get a dirty blue or something. If I want to create those kind of straight lines, I can come in here with a ruler and create really straight lines, okay? You know, that kind of thing. You see how straight they are? And I'd obscure some of this. I'd have to make sure, you know, and then I'd put a couple there, and then I'd probably fill some of these in. like farmland where there's little patches. You know, when you're in a plane, you see all those square patches. I might do something like that. Let's see if this is dry. Let's try it. So we got a nice start on some texture, okay? So now I'd work back into that, okay? I never leave anything just sort of as is. Now I'd work back into this and this will disappear in it, but man, it gets me a nice start on my texture. Make sense? Then I'd probably go back here because towards the horizon, it gets dirtier and lighter. I don't know if I can get away with this much of a blast, but let's try it. I like to pull some of that up into the clouds. Because what I start doing is I start tinting certain parts of the clouds. I want to get a soft edge on this side, yeah? And then it's going to pick up that cloud stuff and sort of start to tint the clouds a little bit. And I might take that a lot further. I might pink them up a little on the bottoms. I want to make sure that's not too strong. You can see how I'm starting to warm up the horizon? I'll let that dry, see how this looks, and I might darken those mountains just a hair, okay? But now we're starting to get a little seam going. Does that make sense? Okay? And one more thing. So now we have this idea, right? So I could use this really nice on rocks, especially as they come into the foreground. If I had a couple of rocks sitting here, I'd really use that and it'll get that granite-y texture, which is nice. I mean, there's a million things I could use it for, right? Things like I'm using it for here. I like to pull this out of the wet wash. I like to pull a lot of things out of the wet wash. I'd probably put another shape in there to soften this edge. I don't look how hard that edge is. This is okay. I'd knock in a few leaf shapes here, you know, hanging off. Now I'd come in here and sort of start to model this up just a hair. I don't want to overdo it. I want to get some shadow values on those masses. Break these edges a little bit. Does that all make sense, you guys? See how it's starting to liven it up a little bit? Get a little contrast in there. And then here, I mean, there's a million things I could use this for, okay? But one of the things I like, I think it's cool for, is to have it create all the background noise for like I said, like a forest thing, okay? On this one, the best part is taking it off and getting that little border, because it automatically makes it look better. I had a teacher one time, he goes, presentation is 75% of everything. I go, it's kind of true. I've seen some really good presentations where the work wasn't that great, but the presentation was so good. It was like, you kind of bought into it, you know? See what I mean? I mean, it's nothing but a little quick thing, but it looks a lot more finished when you do that, okay?
Speaking of presentation, like when you tear off edges, clean them up, would you cut it or would you like tear it?
What do you mean?
I've seen it done both ways.
When I take the tape off?
Or when you crop it closer.
I crop it? You mean like if I want to cut it?
Yeah.
I'm going to cut it with a straight edge and a knife.
Okay. I've seen it done both ways.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, you could do it the other way if you want to have a little more of a deckly edge kind of thing.
Yeah.
If you like that, I think that's just a personal choice. If I'm doing a presentation like for, I don't know, theme park or something like that, I'm cutting everything clean. I'm not doing any of that probably. Okay. Unless I'm making some sort of statement, like if I was doing a presentation and it was for, Pirates of the Caribbean.
Mhm.
I might tear the edge and make it, you know, look more piratey.
Yeah.
I'm gonna dull this out a little bit and just get a gray. But let's say that's my background noise. It's not dark enough. I could start building my forest in front of this thing. And as I build the complexity in the foreground, see how that's going to start sitting back and start representing just all that noise back there? It's going to disappear basically, but it's going to give me all this really nice. It just gets me started where I don't have to spend a lot of time on that right off the bat. You know, and if I start coming in here and building all sorts of foreground elements, this will disappear. But give me that nice noisy background, abstract background that you get in the forest, right? When you're in the forest and you look beyond what you're seeing sort of in your foreground, then it's sort of a middle ground. Then everything goes to abstraction and noise. This gives me abstraction. Does that make sense? Vary this a little bit. Now again, now I could come back in and throw salt in that and get a bunch of texture on the bark if I wanted to, right? Again, you just have to use these things smart and not gimmicky. And then another thing that's fun to do with your dry brush, you know, scrub your brushes the wrong way. You can splay them out and you can get a lot of really nice scrubby and what I'm doing here is I'm sort of creating a base, an underpainting for me to start working into. Does that make sense? And you see how we flood this a little bit with and vary it a little bit, it starts to get more interesting. Now as soon as it dries, I'll probably go, oh, where's my light coming from? And I'd probably darken the other side a little bit. Okay, so it's not so flat. Does that make sense? Does this make sense what I'm saying here? So there's a lot of uses for these things, okay?